And for those who are arriving a little later, I was teeing up our esteemed, and it really is an esteemed speaker here, Allan from Forgerock. For anyone who doesn't know, Forgerock is blazing a trail in identity management and consumer identity management, which is what this track is all about, contributing a lot to standard setting process and their thought leadership. Allan is certainly one of those people who you want to be listening to, and he's talking about a subject that's very close to my heart when we start dealing with consumers. Should we think about it with employees as well, but certainly with consumers, we need to start thinking about privacy issues and consent. And people like Ian on stage this morning and Nishant in the talk before have teed this whole concept up very nicely, and there's no one better to listen to than Allan. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. So one of the things that I've been looking at, I've typically go to a lot of these conferences. And last month we had the European Identity Conference in Germany. Europe is really focused on GDPR. And GDPR is presented a lot around privacy, a lot around regaining control for the user. And I found it very frustrating. The reason I found it very frustrating is that everybody is focused on the financial penalties. It's about conformance, it's about compliance, it's about you've got to meet these things. And I kind of feel they're missing the point. Because the way I see it is that as we start moving into whether it's consumer identity or as we start moving through identity, really what's happening is we are moving into a new kind of civilization. And I map this back to sort of when the Wild West in the US was first sort of discovered, and we had people sort of heading out on horseback and on wagons going out to the Wild West. It was perfectly legitimate to have a disagreement with your neighbor, meet at high noon in Main Street with a 6-gun strapped to your hip, and settle it by shooting each other, and the last man standing wins. Well, we've kind of moved beyond that in the way of settling our grief, and exactly the same thing happens when we start coming in to an online civilization or an online way of dealing with things. And I sort of see consent and privacy exactly in this sort of vein and exactly what we're dealing with. So let's talk a little bit about privacy. A lot of people have said the youngsters of today are just going out and giving all their information away. They don't care about privacy. Two totally different problems. It's perfectly valid to give out your information. Privacy is your decision about what you're actually going to make available to other people, right? So when I look at privacy and I try and define it, I see two main impacts about what privacy is. It is, first of all, an expectation of confidentiality. I am giving you this information and I expect you to treat it with respect. And secondly, I expect you to use it appropriately. Don't do something with it that I'm going to come back after the fact and say, wow, I didn't think you were going to do that, right? I should sort of expect what's going to happen. And to me, that's what privacy is. It doesn't matter what I tell you. It's simply what you are actually dealing with it. And I think that this is where, for us as an industry, there are certain things that are not okay. And we need to start dealing with that we are dealing with a new sort of way of dealing with a civilization. When we give this consent, consent requires trust. If I say to you, yes, you can use this information, I have to trust that you're going to respect my giving you that information. You're going to do the right thing. If I don't trust, well, then it doesn't matter really what I say, because you're going to do whatever you want to, right? And so ultimately, consumer trust that we've been leading into is almost non-existent. And this is where we start coming into that whole deal around GDPR. Why is GDPR there? It's there because as consumers, there is this vastly sort of different trust relationship. We don't have any control. We cannot say what's happening to our data. We have no say in it. We have no ability to be part of the transaction when it comes down to what we are going to do with our information. So in response to this lack of control, we throw all kinds of legislation at it. We have GDPR. In Europe, obviously, we're going to throw lots of fines at all sorts of people, but they aren't the only ones, right? In Canada, we've got PAPEDA. There's various other ones that we have that is all basically consumers trying to get control of their information back under their own control, right? It's them asserting their control. There's a problem with that. And fundamentally, the problem that I have with it is that legislation or regulation is the lowest form of incentive. This is defining the floor on which we stand. I look back again to that whole Wild West thing that we had. When the automobile was first introduced, there were laws put into place to protect people walking in the streets. And these laws basically said that someone had to walk in front of the car with a red flag at a maximum of something like 3 miles an hour, warning pedestrians that this horrible person-killing machine was going to run them over. Good idea, bad execution. And I think a lot of the kinds of things that we're looking at in regulation is achieving the same thing. We are trying to, as consumers, we're trying to assert control over our information, over our data, over our personal information. We're putting all of these regulations in place, and what's happening is the industry is saying, okay, tell me what I have to do to stop my CFO from going to jail. That's ultimately what's happening. And what we're really trying to do is say, guys, just do the right thing, right? Behave properly, and we're trying to change the social norms. So the consumer really has no control over the transaction or the action that's actually going to happen. And this is the fundamental issue about what we're trying to do with things like the PAPEDA and GDPR and all of these privacy regulation issues. In order to be in control, or at least in order to feel in control, the user needs to be an active participant in whatever the action that we're dealing with. Right? In the transaction we're dealing with, the user needs to be an active participant. They need to be a material participant in order to be able to say, yes, this is a good idea, or no, don't do that. So we now need to sort of deal with the user as not just, hey, do you consent to us taking all your information and giving it to advertisers? No, that's not okay. Right? But when we come down to it and say, if you give us this information, here's what we're going to go and do with it, are you okay with that? Most users, as they have already shown, yes, they are okay with that. But there needs to be that trust, and there needs to be that being part of the action. So another way of looking at it, right? Consent. Consent is our user, our consumer, giving a license to use their information. And I use the term license here. It actually came up a couple of other times over the last couple of days. I use the term license because consent is not a one-time thing. Consent is not a checkbox that you have on a website never to be seen again. Consent is a license. A license says, here's what you can do, and I give you permission to do that. And ultimately, I can change my mind. So when we start looking at getting user consent, don't think checkbox. This is a negotiation with our consumer. This is a negotiation with our end user to say, what are we going to do with the information? Right? What information do we need? What are we going to do with it? Do you give me permission to do that? It's constrained permission. And it's the ability for that end user to change their mind. So when I start looking at this, think of the situation of a healthcare situation, right? Where I want to delegate access to my medical records to my son. That's a decision that I'm making, and there's a consent discussion that happens there. However, 3 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, next year, whenever it is, I may want to change my mind, and I may want to renegotiate that trust relationship. Right? So I keep coming back to this. Consent is not an event. Consent is not a checkbox that happens on the web page. Rather, consent is the beginning of a trust relationship. It is a trust relationship between the consumer and the provider that's dealing with that. And that trust relationship happens over time. We give consent, we then interact with that, and eventually that consent sort of dies off, right? And we have an end of that. So it's an ongoing agreement between these two parties about what's going to happen with that data. We as service providers, as application developers, as whatever it is we're working and interacting with the consumer, we need to start thinking about this, that consent is actually an ongoing agreement between us and the end user. So in the identity world, we are very used to thinking about life cycles. We think about provisioning, and we have account creation and account management, and eventually that whole problem in IT of what do we do with accounts that are no longer valid and trying to reap them back in. Consent is exactly the same thing. Consent, and the reason that I'm calling it consent lifecycle, is that as we start building systems to deal with consent, we should be thinking about consent as an entire lifecycle. It has a beginning, it has an ongoing process that we're getting from here to there, and then eventually there's an end, right? And I'll sort of go through each one of these pieces as we sort of talk about it. Getting consent, this is the checkbox, but there's so much more to it than that, right? This is actually establishing the trust relationship between us and the consumer. 2 years ago, I moved over to Singapore. I lived in Singapore for a year, and I travel a lot, so I found a local travel agent, a web-based travel agent that I could buy my tickets with. They did a good job. I gave them my credit card number. They bought tickets for me. Everything was good. At the end of the year, I moved back to the US, not because of anything that travel agent did, and I believe that they probably are still a good travel agent, but I didn't need them anymore. And so from my perspective, we started the consent relationship. I gave them my credit card, and at the end of that process, I want them to stop using my credit card. I want to end that relationship because I don't need it anymore, right? And that's part of that whole consent process. So as we start building applications, the kinds of things that we should be thinking about in terms of interacting with our users is that we're doing this, whatever it is, we're doing this with them. We're not doing it for them. And so the kinds of questions we should come up with is, actually, what information do we need? Why do we need it? 2 weeks ago, I checked into a hotel in London. Now, as an American in London, I don't get much say about what happens, but I check into the hotel and they said, I need your passport. Okay, I gave them my passport. They took it into the back office and they made a photocopy of it, which went with my reservation. I was feeling in a bad mood at that point, so I started having an identity discussion with the lady behind the desk. And my question, which I thought was legitimate, was, what happens to that picture? When does that photocopy get destroyed? And she answered, oh, it doesn't. It goes into the file. At that point, I still needed the hotel room, so I wasn't going to get into a longer discussion. But the reality about it is, why does she need my passport? Why does she need a photocopy of my passport? Right? To me, it's really valuable. It lets me get in and out of borders all over the place. But why does she need my passport? Really for one reason only, to prove to her manager that she looked at it. That's the only reason, really, that she's making that copy. She doesn't need that copy. If she had given me, and we had some concept of a receipt, right, then at that point, she could prove to her manager, I checked his passport and he's allowed to be here, or it's the right name, we can move on from there. But no, now I've given up this copy of my passport that who knows what hotels that copy is lying and in some file or some folder somewhere. So really, when we start looking at why do we need this information, what are we going to use it for? How are we going to use it, right? All of these are actually the foundation issues around establishing that trust relationship, right? Once we've done that, we then start managing it. This is our application. This is what we do. This is what we're offering to the user, right? What data do we have? Who has access to it? Are we actually treating this data with respect? Are we giving it the appropriate confidential behavior that it deserves, right? Who has access to it? Do we still need it? Again, I go back to the nice young lady in the hotel. Does she still need my passport today? And I would say, no, she doesn't, right? Maybe while I was in the hotel, okay, validly they've got a copy of it. But does she need it today? No. So we should be able to go back at this and say, why do we need this data? Do we still need it? And what's our exposure if it were to be compromised, right? If the terms have changed, either on my part or on the end user's part, right? If at some point the end user says to us, no, I don't want my children to have access to my medical records anymore. That's a perfectly valid decision for the end user to make, and they should be able to come back in and uncheck that checkbox. What if we change that agreement or the terms fundamentally change? And then we look at termination of that consent. This is not a bad thing, right? It's the end of that trust relationship. And it's perfectly valid for that trust relationship to end for perfectly valid reasons. It's not that anybody has behaved badly. It's not that I don't like you anymore. It's simply the aspect that conditions have now changed and I don't need that to happen anymore. And I'd go back to my Singapore travel agent. They did a good job, but I'm not buying tickets from them anymore. I now live back in the US. They don't need to have my credit card. From my perspective, it was my convenience that they had my credit card, so I could click on the red button and say, oh, buy me another ticket. I'm going to go to Hong Kong today. And it was my convenience to do that. And I can change that relationship. And so when we come down for it, when that trust relationship ends, we as service providers have a responsibility around respect for that data. Do we know where it is? What have we done with that data? What systems have we copied it into? One of the requirements of GDPR, which I think is probably scaring the heck out of almost any company around the world, is the fact that you as a consumer should be able to go to one of these, an entity or a company, an enterprise, and say to them, please tell me the information that you have about me. Think of what that means for Hilton Hotels, right? They now have to go out and find all of the drawers that my passport picture is stored in. And say, oh yeah, we've got one in London, we've got one in Germany, we've got several in the US, or all over the places. Do they actually know where my information is being stored? Because from my perspective, that information is actually really valuable. I care about that. And since I care about it, the service provider should care about it as well. And so this whole process around what happens at the end of this relationship when the user wants to unsubscribe, the user wants to stop using the service, whatever the reason is, can we actually find all of the different data that we've stored about that user? Can we delete it? Who have we shared it with? The GDPR also has a term in it which is the right to be forgotten. I don't know that I can fully defend that, because the reality is you can go on Google and find out just about everything about anyone. But the reality about it is that at the end of the day, if I say I no longer wish to have this relationship, in a real world relationship, I can remove myself from a joint bank account. I can remove myself from the utility bill. I can remove myself from the phone bill. Why can I not remove myself from this relationship that I've established with whatever entity this is? And so this is a mind shift for us as identity professionals in terms of thinking about how we deal with the end user's data and working with them as an active participant in this management of their data. It's with them, not for them. The reality about it is that we don't need anything new in order to do this. It's there. We have the protocols. We've got things like UMA. We've got OAuth. We've got all of the federation protocols. we know more about the end user than probably is good for us. So all of the protocols are absolutely there. In fact, there are many situations where the digital experience is actually better than the physical experience. But we as designers have to be able to deal with that. And really, once we, as the application world, as the identity world, are able to sort of move to having the consumer as an active participant in the relationship, they trust us. They now have control over their data, and that builds to a trusted relationship. Once you have a trusted relationship, it is absolutely amazing what that user will let us do with their data because they trust us to do what we say and say what we do. So ultimately, it's all about building trust. And looking back on regulations like GDPR, that's really what it's about. It's about end users who are feeling powerless, they're feeling out of control, and therefore have no trust with the industry. And it's our job to get that trust back by treating them with respect. And at that point, I'm ending up, so thank you.
Not sure. Oh, this is working. Fantastic. Thanks, Alan. That was fascinating. I took some messages out of that, and I love the line, regulation is the lowest form of incentive. I couldn't agree more. I've been lucky enough in my career to work with a number of boards in some of the more enlightened consumer-facing organizations, and I would say almost without exception, the most profitable organizations now are the ones that took their customers seriously. They stopped thinking them as a figure. ARPU, average revenue per user, is the one that's used in the telecoms industry a lot. And when they started thinking them about being actual people and customers who have a relationship with and you want them to stick around for a while, things like consent and privacy and taking their information seriously are the things that create the stickiest relationships, and stickiest relationships are usually the most profitable. So if you want to raise the profile of identity in your organizations, I'd encourage you all to go back and find a senior exec and sit down and say, hey, we need to talk about identity and privacy and how we can boost the revenues of this business based on these techniques. But anyway, you're not here to listen to me. Questions for Alan? Should we start down here? Oh.
There's a lot of things I could discuss about your presentation, but the one I want to focus on is the whole consent idea. And it's great that companies should do the right thing, but we know, at least in the U.S., they don't do the right thing. If you look at Facebook as my prime example. So in terms of consent, I don't understand how you can really have a good consent relationship, since that usually requires a mutual agreement between the parties. And in the case of a company like Facebook, there's so much transparency in the power of Facebook versus the consumer, or the user, I should say, not even really the consumer. That is basically take it or leave it. If you don't like our terms, don't sign up for an account. It's that simple. And I'd like to ask you how you would address that in terms of, other than regulation, what can we do to change that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In the model that we're currently dealing with, the Facebooks and the ones where it's not all right about the way that they deal with our data, yes, regulation is the lowest form of incentive, but regulation gives us a floor on which to stand. Regulation tells us, this is what you have to do in order to remain in polite society. My personal way of dealing with that, I don't have a Facebook account. You're all welcome to sign up to my MySpace account. It's really cool. But the reality about it is that we see Facebook as this gigantic monolith that is there forever. As we did with MySpace, as we did with Yahoo, as we did with all of these other ones. And at some point, the industry is going to define a norm about how we deal with users. And the Facebooks of the world, although right now they are mainstream, will become outliers. And if they don't behave properly, they will start losing users, as in fact lots of people are leaving. So they will start losing them, and no, I don't think we can go in and deal with Facebook today and have them change. But if we as an industry move on, they will be forced to follow or go out of business. It's sort of the mantra of e-commerce, right? You either follow or you stay with what the industry is doing, or you go out of business. And I'm not saying Facebook's going out of business, but that's sort of the real thing. We exert peer pressure.
Any more questions for Allan? Oh, yep. There's one.
Well, now they've got a camera, right? So, yeah, but there is actually an upswell in exactly the same thing. Look at the way that Apple dealt with the San Bernardino case, right? That was, whether you agree or not with the way that they behaved in a consumer-centric way that basically said, no, that trust relationship is something we value, and we are not going to violate that trust. So, yes, companies are doing it. In Kentara, we are talking about things like the consent receipt. So the industry is beginning to look at technology and ways to try and address that. In the DIAC up in Canada, there's an entire process around how do you manage consent, and consent is a very important aspect up in Canada. So yeah, there is a swell in general of industry looking at how they can deal with consent. GDPR is also a driver for that, because even though it's an obscure EU regulation that's not going to affect any of us in the US, one of their sort of little fine print fines, right, that when they start putting fines out, which is, I don't know, May or something of next year, their fines are up to 4% of your global gross revenue. For companies like Citibank, American Airlines, Delta, these kinds of companies, 4% of gross revenue is a big, big chunk of change. And so maybe it's a little bit of judicial overreach from the EU. However, they are saying that they can fine anyone anywhere that simply even begins to talk to a European resident. Obviously, still has to go to court to see how far-reaching those are, but those are significant threats. In fact, I don't know the details of it, but this week or last week, there was a European case against Google around the basically private information and management of private data. So those threats are there, even though they're not coming from the US and coming within our boundaries. We're moving to an increasingly global economy. And so even US companies have European customers and end up being subject to those regulations.
Allan, just to add to that, I think there's two points I'd make on that, which is a great question. The GDPR is, and I was part of the body that responded, or one of the bodies that responded to the legislation that was being developed. And if anybody doesn't know, it was the single most commented on piece of legislation the European Commission has ever released, which just amazes me even to this day, given you've got M&A type legislation and health standards and all kinds of things. The privacy legislation is the most commented on because it's how sweeping it was. But it is extraterritorial. How they're going to actually implement that is another question. But if you process European citizens' data, no matter where you're based in the world as a company, you fall under the GDPR. And yes, there is 4% of global turnover. So that's one incentive, but I would flip it around. And I'd say this is not the way to get US businesses thinking about this, is they'll be fined by some European body. The way to get businesses here thinking about this is a good thing to do for your business. You will build a better relationship with your customers if you actually manage the consent process well, and you let them make choices, and you let them back out if they want to for the right reasons. Just as Allan was saying, this is good practice. And I think if you can look at some of the things that end up happening in Europe, because of the legislation might be the driver, but look at the good things that happen in customer engagement and customer management, I think there'll be some things that could differentiate business. And And why not stand up and be leaders? You know, you don't have to do something, you don't have to wait until there's legislation to do something that's good for your business. You can get on and do that anytime. So that would be my thoughts on that. Somebody else stuck their hand up, I think. Was there another question somewhere around here? Yeah. 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 For everyone who couldn't hear, the question was about, you know, what about auditability of consent? Where's the proof, the chain of evidence? Alan, you got some thoughts on that?
So from a Kantara perspective, we're doing work on the consent receipt, which fundamentally is a PKI signed document on both sides that indicates what the consent, when the consent was given, what the consent was pertaining to, and what the actual consent given was, that could now be managed on both sides. So there's a provability on both sides for that. So the Mark Lazar is actually here, and he's the chairperson of that working group. So if you want to talk about it, find Mark and talk about it with him, because he will talk your ear off on that whole topic. Absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Yes, so Alan, for everyone who's left, if you can thank Alan in the usual way for a fascinating talk.